Tribal Police Service, and Chief Doris Bill. So I'll just simply call on the witnesses for their 7-minute presentations in the order in which they appear on the order paper. So with that, Chief Picard, 7 minutes, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I know that technologically speaking, interpretation between French and English does pose some challenges, so I will make my presentation in French only. And certainly I will be able to answer questions in either French or English, if there are any questions. Chair, members of the Standing Committee, thank you so much. First of all, at the outset, I would like to point out that I certainly support the comments that have been made by my colleague who was appearing earlier today, Regional Chief Terry Teachy from British Columbia. As you know, he's assumed the responsibility of the National Justice Portfolio for First Nations at the Assembly of First Nations on a Canada-wide level. And I would also like to thank the Rwanda Nation that has hosted me for this presentation today. At the outset, systemic discrimination must be seen as part of Canada's colonial past. Law enforcement played a major role in the colonization process. For example, it was the police who abducted our children and forced them into residential schools. It was the police who prevented our people from participating in their ceremonies and practicing their spirituality, while others saw the police as a service for their protection and safety. Our people saw the police as the oppressors, to such an extent that in many First Nations languages, policing is translated as those who take us away. Despite constitutional guarantees and several Supreme Court decisions, First Nations constitutional and treaty rights continue to be violated with impunity. While systemic racism and discrimination are widely recognized and documented, some prefer to view them as the problems of others, denying that they are rooted in the very fabric of Canadian society. The right to protection and safety is something that other citizens can take for granted. However, we, the First Nations peoples, living on our territories, do not have this assurance. This is first and foremost a human rights issue, but it is also a question of the relationship between the justice and police systems and our peoples. Why is the issue of the relationship between First Nations peoples in Canada and law enforcement so difficult to address? The strained relationship between First Nations people and police has been the subject of so many stories since the 1960s and has been documented over and over again. Since 1967, at least 13 reports have examined this relationship. They have addressed every facet of the situation. There are countless research reports that have looked at it. In every case, the conclusion is the same. Canada has failed. Those who still doubt that the justice system has failed our people may want to take a close look at our current reality. Many studies have confirmed that the First Nations people are more likely to be detained by the police following an arrest, most often on the basis of prejudice and racism. They are also more likely to be detained for longer periods of time. In the framework of the bail process, they are more likely to be sentenced to jail, and too often for a long period of time. They are more likely to be imprisoned for non-payment of fines. You can add to these deplorable facts that First Nations people are more likely to be killed in police actions. First Nations women are not excluded from these statistics. A recent report published on the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal indicates that the First Nations women are a target group because they are 11 times more likely to be arrested than are white women. As indicated in the report on the inquiry on missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, there are numerous reports of police abuse, excessive use of force, misconduct, racial profiling. These actions carried out by the police are incompatible with their function as peace officers and are indicative of systemic racism. Today, more than ever, the state must ensure that the police protect the public and that mechanisms are in place to protect the public. Yet, over the years, despite numerous attempts to remedy the situation, the state has failed to adopt accommodation measures that truly mitigate the effects of the imposition of Canadian legislation on First Nations peoples. The problems of systemic discrimination against First Nations are still not being addressed in a manner that reflects the urgency of the situation. Violence against First Nations continues to make headlines. The time for rhetoric and political immobility is over. It is time to address the various problems that plague the justice and police systems. Other studies or surveys will not tell us more about what we already know. Canada must take immediate action, introduce a national plan, and commit the provinces to formally recognize systemic racism. This action plan must also commit all governments at all levels to eradicate all forms of racism and discrimination against First Nations people in its institutions, and it should start with policing. The right way forward is to establish a national strategy and action plan for First Nations justice and policing. We need a collaborative engagement process to jointly develop legislation which is designed to implement the necessary criminal justice and policing reforms. This is the task before us. This is a national emergency. Systemic racism has gone on far too long. And by way of conclusion, I would just like to reiterate the support that I give to the recommendation that was brought forward by Terry T.G., my colleague, the Regional Chief, this morning before you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Picard. Our next witness is Terry McCaffrey, President and Chief of Police at the Wickamong Tribal Police Service. Mr. McCaffrey.
Good afternoon. I would like to start by recognizing the two territories that we're meeting on this afternoon. The Wickwamcong unceded territory, comprised of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, and the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I would like to thank you all for the opportunity to appear before this committee to provide these submissions today on behalf of the Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, also known as IPCO. My name is Terry McCaffrey, and I am the Chief of Police for the Wickwamcong Tribal Police Service and the President of IPCO. It has been an honor over my 24-year policing career to have served over 35 First Nation communities across 3 provinces, including Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario, all under the First Nation policing program known as the FNPP. IPCO is comprised of 9 self-administered Indigenous police forces across Ontario. Those services are the Akwesasne Mohawk Police Service, the Anishinaabe Police Service, the Laksua Police, Aski Police Service, Rama Police Service, Six Nations Police Service, Treaty 3 Police Service, the UCCM Anishinaabe Police Service, and the Wickwamcong Tribal Police Service. IPCO is a non-for-profit organization incorporated under the Canada Non-for-Profit Corporations Act and was incorporated on September 16th, 2019. The Vice President of IPCO is Gerald Swamp, who is the Chief of Rama Police Service, and the Secretary-Treasurer I also recognize is Roland Morrison, Chief for the Anishinaabe Police Service. IPCO advocates in unity for equality for our Indigenous policing services. Our mission statement is that our 9 standalone Indigenous police services are standing together as one to advocate for policing membership, essential service status, full parity with other Ontario police services that would include wages, benefits, and pensions, full and adequate staffing, equitable for our unique needs, legitimate recognition as the experts in Indigenous policing, and policing that is fully autonomous. For decades, self-administered First Nation policing in the province of Ontario has been chronically underfunded. First Nation officers have been forced to work in conditions which other officers throughout the province and country, for that matter, would never be subjected to. As policing programs, Indigenous police services are not subject to any policing legislation, and our communities have not had the benefit of policing backed by the rule of law. The severe underfunding of Indigenous policing creates a unity between the police service, the community, and political leadership in our combined advocacy to the federal and provincial governments for fair and equitable funding to ensure our Indigenous police services can provide effective, efficient, and culturally responsive policing to the communities that we serve. We are proud that despite these serious impediments, we have managed to progress and have truly created a connection with our communities that is built on cultural respect and autonomy. IPCO was pleased to hear Minister Blair say that First Nation policing must be made an essential service, and recognizing that we have been overlooked for far too long. The June 23, 2020 edition of the Toronto Star, reporting on Minister Blair's comments about making First Nation policing an essential service, discussed a report by the Council of Canadian Academies, which said these many Indigenous communities without Indigenous policing services are stuck with a colonial policing model that overlooks Indigenous cultural traditions and fails to create the necessary bonds of trust. The IPCO services have made the effort to ensure that our policing services align with the values of our community, instead of trying to force our communities to align with conventional policing values. We are the experts in culturally responsive policing. A perfect example of our police services aligning with our community values are the recent First Nation border closures and community COVID measures that have taken place during the current pandemic. In early March, First Nation leadership were considering putting measures in place to close borders to protect the health and safety of community members. Political leadership made clear to Indigenous police services that they did not want to rely on a delegation of power from the Indian Act, but rather wanted to rely on their inherent right and requested that police service enforce the border closures. In consultation and collaboration with political leadership, our Indigenous police services assisted in the creation of a governance model that vested in the inherent right to self-government and relied on existing provincial legislation, such as the Emergency Management and Protection Act and the Trespass to Property Act, for enforcement. This governance approach was initially met with resistance, and the Solicitor General for Ontario, Ms. Sylvia Jones, recommended that communities pass bylaws under the Indian Act for border closures, even though the Indian Act bylaws were devoid of any prosecutorial or adjudicative mechanisms. It was recommended that these bylaws could be used as teaching tools. This approach was wholly rejected by our communities. Our leadership wanted a governance process that allowed for enforcement of the border closures and community COVID measures. After numerous correspondence by political leadership and IPCO to the Ontario Attorney General and Minister Jones, we were informed on July 13, 2020 by Attorney General Downey that the provincial government takes very seriously the importance of ensuring that the emergency protection measures that are put in place in First Nation communities to ensure the safety and well-being of their members during this outbreak are effectively and consistently enforced. This letter goes on to advise that the political government will prosecute any charges laid relating to border closures under the EMCPA and the Trespass to Property Act. I understand that aspects of Indigenous policing model are not transferable to the conventional policing, and I also accept that Indigenous policing model is not perfect. But what we do have that at times some conventional police services lack, especially with racialized and Indigenous communities, is trust. The years of over-policing of Indigenous, Black, and other marginalized people by conventional policing services has caused the significant mistrust of police. We have seen this play out in the United States with the protests in the wake of the George Floyd deaths, as well as here in Canada with the recent police-involved deaths of an Indigenous man, Mr. Rodney Levi, and an Indigenous woman, Ms. Chantel Moore. Communities want accountability from the police. Indigenous police services are accountable to our communities, and not just when there's a tragedy. We are responsible and accountable each and every day. That is what culturally responsive policing looks like in our Indigenous communities. We design our services to be culturally responsive, and we train our officers to provide culturally responsive policing services. This is our standard, and ultimately, this is our strength. As Sir Robert Peel set out in his 9 principles of policing, in order for the police to properly perform their duties, there must be public approval for police actions. And the more police engage in the use of physical force, the more public cooperation with the police will diminish. Our Indigenous police services live these principles. IPCO participated in this process today to offer a hand in friendship and reconciliation, despite our concerns about the lack of appropriate funding for Indigenous police services. Because we truly believe that the community collaboration and culturally responsive policing engaged in by Indigenous police services are models that could be helpful to rebuilding public trust and confidence in conventional policing here in our country. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Merci. Kinanaskamitano.
Thank you. Chief Doris Bull, 7 minutes, please.
That's Bill.
I'm sorry. That's the disadvantage of getting old. You have to read glasses on. I apologize for that.
That's okay. Well, Dunjay, and good afternoon. I guess it's where you are. I thank you for the invitation to be a part of this very important conversation. And I look forward to sharing information about my community, the Kwanlin First Nation, or KDFN, and summarizing a collaborative, community-driven approach we have created to address community safety concerns. I am not here today to dispute whether systemic racism in policing exists. While I can't say it is as widespread as it once was, I think we can all agree it is real. And
ce type de racisme persiste dans de nombreuses institutions et communautés aujourd'hui. Compte tenu de la conversation.
By saying, I openly support those speaking out against systemic racism, and I acknowledge the harmful effects it has had on the health and well-being of First Nations people, and indeed other people of color. At the same time, I see value in our existing policing services. While I am not a supporter of the calls to defund policing services, reform is needed. Here at home, I am sure our police department could use some additional resources, given the increased crime in our area. In some cases, the increased demands and inadequate resources has had a trickle-down effect, especially as it relates to prioritized calls and response times. Citizens have reported it can sometimes take an hour or more for an officer to show up, where calls where no officers attended at all. To provide further insight, shortly after I was elected in 2014, KDFN began looking for ways in which to deal with community safety concerns. I think the breaking point came after the murders of 2 people. Unfortunately, these tragedies were the catalyst for change. It brought to the surface many issues and challenges around being an urban First Nation. Through many discussions with our citizens, we learned of numerous break-ins and violent crimes. We heard from single moms who were sleeping with baseball bats by their beds, from elders who didn't feel safe going out for a walk, and from citizens concerned with bootlegging and drug houses. Simply put, our community was crying out for change. It was also made very clear there still remained a strong distrust of the police. People are often reminded of the trauma from residential school, the 60s scoop, and forced relocations when dealing with the police. Not to mention the intergenerational fallout continues to be a challenge. And let's not forget about the unfinished business surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In many ways, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, along with its 94 recommendations and our constitutionally protected final and self-government agreements, helped to establish the initial path forward. The first step in any crisis is the admission that there is a problem, and there needs to be a demonstrated willingness to listen and participate in the hard discussions. That also means not being afraid to scrutinize your own environment. We cannot criticize if we are not willing to accept our own shortcomings. In our case, we chose to listen, learn from one another, and put the words into action. From the onset, we knew if we were going to turn things around, we had to engage our community. And if meaningful change were to occur, it had to come from within. We also needed to reset and rebuild relationships with our community partners. So together with the community's help, we created a comprehensive community safety plan, established an interagency working group of community partners, including the Rcmp, Bylaw Services, Safer Communities and Neighborhoods Unit, or SCAN, Public Safety and Investigations and Correction Services Canada, and we built an innovative Community Safety Officer Program, or CSO program, which launched in 2016. It is the CSO program that I wish to highlight today. The program is designed to strengthen relationships and works closely with law enforcement, provides early detection and de-escalation of conflict in the community, and is culturally responsive and has been well received by our citizens. I wish to be clear, the CSO program is not intended to replace the police. The 4 officers we have don't enforce the law, but help to de-escalate in certain situations. They have also intervened in cases that could have ended badly, especially for women who were in unsafe situations. It is a great example of conflict-free resolution. It has proven its worth by not only to the community, but to the Rcmp, and they have provided support to this program because it has been such a help. The CSO program frees up Rcmp officers to do other work. The calls to service have been reduced significantly since the program started. While funding continues to be an issue, the program has gained full participation of Yukon government, Rcmp, and many other community partners. We have learned a lot about each other in the process. Any officer working in a First Nation community needs to understand the dynamics, the culture, the history, and the trauma of our people. This is key to strengthen relationship with the community. We remain committed to the process, and recently we signed a historic document with Rcmp defining a new relationship. The Letter of Expectation, or LOE, promotes a positive and cooperative relationship and provides policing, priorities, goals, and strategies that are specific to the needs of KDFN. Ultimately, it is about choosing a path where strong partnerships allow us to develop the kind of policing we know we need in our community. If we are truly going to make a difference, the justice system must create the space for community-born safety initiatives like ours. I think we can agree together we can bring about the much-needed change we seek.
Thank you, Chief Bill. Our first question in the 6-minute round is Monsieur Boltoud. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I would like to thank each of our witnesses today. I've been here today to replace someone else, but this has been very informative, and I'm learning a lot about your realities. I am learning more about the reality of systemic racism in Indigenous and Inuit communities. My first question goes to Chef Picard. The Public Safety Minister is proposing a bill to make Indigenous police services an essential service. We've talked about the necessary collaboration that we'll need to fight systemic racism. The National Indigenous Association chief adopted a resolution so that the government could recognize Indigenous police services as essential services, and that and so that they can support them and fund them like other police forces in the country. Have you started discussions with the government on this bill that was promised by Minister Blair? Thank you very much for the question. This question is very relevant. Yes, we are currently in the engagement stage. During your next meetings in the fall, we will be having meetings about this, and we will be working promptly to prepare us for that session. The sooner we get going, the sooner we can table a bill that meets our expectations. After this good experience, it helped us to collaboratively write a bill. I'm referring to Bill C-92 here. This bill is regarding youth and First Nations children. Of course, some positions have been repeated many times. Many times we've wanted to see our services recognized as essential. Also, nationally, there is a resolution that was proposed to say that funding should be proportional to real needs. I think that this is an important nuance. So yes, we are hoping that we will quickly get to work. But to properly understand things, Chief Picard, you're saying that there were some discussions or there is a will to work with you, but have the discussions started? Right now, we're still in the discussions stage to create the best possible conditions to get involved. However, we haven't established any objectives. Who do you think should be involved in this process to get a proper bill tabled in the House of Commons? Usually, we have chief committees at the national level that discuss all sorts of topics. In this current context, we haven't determined a process that looks like what we already have. It could be a different process. We could create a working group. As for C-92, we had a working group that was technical and political. We had a group of chiefs as well as a group of experts in social services. This could also be a possibility for this current project. Very well. Thank you very much. My next question goes to Chief McCaffrey. Mr. McCaffrey, do you think that the Rcmp has burned some bridges in June when they did not want to recognize the existence of systemic racism within its institution? Have they burned bridges with the communities?
So I know that the Rcmp, they have their best intentions when looking to serve Indigenous communities. And I've had many conversations with the higher level Rcmp officers across the country about these very issues. But a lot of the discussion here is about police reform and how our police services are serving our Indigenous communities. So one particular issue that comes up with the Rcmp that I'll bring to light, they may not see it that way, is policing for the people by the people. So there may be an individual that wants to work in their community, but typically the policy there is that they're not going back there. Here in Wequemcong, we are representative of our community. We are 90% of our officers are from here and have ties and roots here. And because of that, there is much more community connection. So that, as far as burning bridges, I can't specifically speak to that, but I think that there's a lot more that conventional policing can do to build bridges.
You have about 15 seconds. Should I just move on? All right. That, Mr.
Oui,
Mr.
parce que le temps de
Anantangri.
traduire sera terminé, Monsieur le Président. Donc, merci beaucoup aux témoins.
I'm done, Mr. Chair, so thank you to the witnesses.
6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today. And at the end, I'll be sharing some time with Ms. Damoff. I know Chief Picard started off with kind of a historical perspective on policing, and we've heard that from a number of witnesses today about its impact on Indigenous peoples, and therefore the need and the call for more Indigenous people to be police officers, but also, and more importantly, self-determination with respect to policing. So I'd like to really pose these set of questions to Chief McCaffrey as well as Chief Bill. In terms of the confidence of the communities that you serve, do you think it's better, far better, or exceptionally better than that in relation to non-Indigenous led police services?
I would like to speak to that. I would say that it is far better. And the reason being is that what it boils down to is we do not come in with a different set of values from our community. We come in and we adapt our values of our police service to that of our community. So that way we are aligning ourselves with our community and creating a strategic plan that specifically speaks to meeting the cultural responsiveness that our community needs. That in itself is being culturally responsive. That in itself is building partnerships with our community and making it so that at the end of the day, we are community members. We're not an occupying force. We are the community, and the community is us.
Chief Bill?
Yes, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I totally agree. You know, our CSO officers are not an enforcement body, and that is the difference, you know, between our community safety officer program and the Rcmp. And when we did a survey amongst our citizens, we asked them the question, do you want the CSOs to have enforcement powers? And they said loud and clear, no, we don't. And you know, our officers are all Indigenous. We have one woman, and we have one or a couple of them are now from our community. And I think that is the difference. The difference is that they are from our community. Our community knows and trusts these individuals. They have roots and ties to these people, and you know, our people know that they can go to them and trust them. And they work alongside the Rcmp officers, and they actually act as a liaison between the officers and the communities they serve.
So for both of you again, what are some of the challenges that you face, especially with recruitment, retention, as well as interaction with the Rcmp or the police service of jurisdiction? So I guess Mr. McCaffrey in Ontario would be the OPP, I would gather.
Yeah, that's correct. So recruitment and retention for us specifically doesn't seem to be a problem. What it boils down to is our community supports us. So because of that, we're able to work with our community and build recruiting sessions that are attracting people from our community. Right now, at this very moment here in our detachment, I have two post-secondary students working here as students. We build these processes into our service to allow for succession and to allow for there to be a buildup of the service. And again, and I'll speak to what Mr. Picard spoke about, saying that in most Indigenous cultures and languages, when you talk about police, it's the man that takes you away. We've changed the name of our police service here to be Inagduenjigit, which means those that help. Right. And by changing that frame and rebranding what it is we actually do, we are attracting more people to this profession and to work for Indigenous police services.
As for Kwan Dunn, I don't think that recruitment so far hasn't been a huge problem. I think people needed to know and to understand what the CSO's officers were and how they would operate. Retention, I think it's still too early for us to really, think about that. But they work. The program actually helps the RCMP, I believe. It helps the RCMP by bringing down calls, and it has saved time and money. And the RCMP, in turn, is able to focus on other things. And we've gotten to the point where the RCMP have been the one-stop shop of law enforcement, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are some things that communities can do on their own instead of always going to the RCMP.
I'm going to pose a final question to Chief Picard. Are these...
Unfortunately, Chief Picard is not going to have a chance to answer it, but go ahead and pose your question.
Are these the forms of drawn down self-determination that you envision with respect to policing?
Very briefly, please. You got your mic on the mute.
Sorry. Excusez-moi, oui.
Yes, I think that Mr. McCaffrey is a perfect example of what we want to do. We want to have services just like the UN Declaration on Indigenous Services in one of their articles.
Mr. Anand-Thangri, Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you so much to our witnesses for their evidence. My question is for Mr. Picard. We spoke a little about the status of services. What do you think about the role that's played by the federal government in this area? Can you tell me in terms of the context that exists in the First Nations? Well, I would say that the efforts of the federal government have been well received by us. When the bill that was brought in by Mr. Blair, it was something that was a very good step forward because that allowed for a step in the right direction. The jurisdiction in many cases is shared with provincial governments, so it's also important to have the federal government be in a position where it can play its role, its leadership role, and other than certain ideologies at different levels in certain provincial governments, particularly in Quebec, not so much in Ontario, where you have a provincial service. But it's important to ensure that we can have the climate that would be propitious for reaching a good agreement. But this is something that we want in our community. This is and in fact, there are communities that have already had their own police services. They want to be able to continue to do so. Thank you. You talk about leadership. Do you think that the federal government, even though it's a responsibility, is very clear with respect to public safety vis-a-vis the First Nations? Do you think that the federal government has provided the necessary resources for your having a well-trained police system on a community level? Well, this has been existing since 1991. And over 10 years since its creation, we have colleagues, Mr. McCaffrey, for example, and others who preceded him, have created programs that were useful, that were not always successful. And I think that it's not always apparent. The program should not be a program that is a purely based on the regulatory system that exists for other police forces throughout the country, I think we have to look at it differently. I believe that the federal government can go far as possible in trying to establish the bases for all of our nations in our communities, but it does have a provincial responsibility as well. Thank you. You spoke about C-92 earlier on that was brought before Parliament and that dealt with First Nations and services that were offered in terms of children and family. Do you believe that the necessary tools have been given to all communities to adequately develop a structure that will allow for the stakeholders to be in a good financial position? Well, I think that if we want to go in that direction, we have to assume that we will have all the tools necessary to be able to, at the end of the day, obtain our objectives, obtain our goals. And there's no judgment that can be made now. As I said, it's been almost 20 years now where there has been a program, but it has not delivered as well as it should for the communities. I think the federal government should go further in terms of C-92. This has been cited as an example. I know that there is some challenge with respect to it in the courts in the province of Quebec by the Quebec government. But I do think that the C-92, as it could be the case in other pieces of legislation, that First Nations should have the ability to exercise their full autonomy. That is what we are seeking. Thank you. I think there was a solution that was brought up that we've heard before. That is to say that there could be a civil oversight in communities that would be independent. There would be oversight over the various activities by police forces. What do you think about that? Well, we know that there is a significant gap in terms of trust in certain communities, in urban communities or other communities outside of the urban area. Earlier, I gave the example of the city of Montreal, where there was an event that was very concerning. As almost 2 months ago, at the beginning of May, where an Indigenous woman called an ambulance, and with the ambulance, there was a contingent of 17 police officers that arrived. This is aberrant. We don't want to see this. So I think there has to be reform in terms of the police and people.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentations. The passion and the knowledge is very evident, and we're blessed to hear from you all today. I think this issue is extremely important, and I would like to start by asking Police Chief McCaffrey to tell us, in terms of the use of force, which is a big issue, of course, nationally in the last short while, but is a long-term big issue. Does your police force get different training than other police forces, and what is the nature of that? And the use of force training differ? And how do your operational activities with respect to use of force differ, if they do, from other police forces?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm very happy to answer this. There is no difference. Our officers are trained to the same standard that every officer in Ontario is trained to. And that goes for all IPCO, IPCO representation. So 500 officers, Indigenous policing services officers across Ontario. We're all trained to the same standard in terms of use of force, in terms of de-escalation and everything else. I think where we are more successful and why we have less incidents of having to use situations of force comes down to our connection to the community and our direct, connection and knowing that, it's much better for us to try to de-escalate these situations as opposed to where maybe that might not be the case in a setting where you don't have a connection to the people that you're serving, or as close a connection, I would say, that Indigenous policing has with our communities.
Tell me, Police Chief McCaffrey, what is the relationship between your police force and the OPP, is in terms of backup, or in terms of do you have overlapping police jurisdiction within the areas you police, and how does that work?
Absolutely. So I can speak. The OPP are definitely partners in policing with Indigenous police services across Ontario. Commissioner Karique and the men and women that serve with him, with the Ontario Provincial Police, are partners with us through and through. What I can say, though, is that it's still imperative, though, that we are chronically underfunded provincially and federally. And but so it was kind of alluded to from Mr. Picard that this is a program, and it's been based on a program. When you look at how other mainstream policing is funded, it's they're not. They just don't take it upon themselves to say, yeah, we trust that the police are going to do what they're going to do. It's based in legislation. Where Indigenous policing is based is in a program. And that's the area that needs to change, and that's the area where we need to significantly look at.
So I take it then you would support the notion suggested by Chief Picard and Chief Tagee earlier today, that there should be a national First Nations justice and policing strategy overall to cover this issue.
Absolutely, and that organizations like IPCO and organizations like the First Nation Chiefs of Police Association are at that table as subject matter experts and not brought late to the game like we often are.
In 2018, the then Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness announced up to $291 million over 5 years to support additional support for First Nations and Inuit communities served under the First Nations policing program, and identified our 187 First Nations policing agreements. That doesn't seem to be a lot of money at 58 or 60 million dollars a year over 5 years for that many organizations. Is that an example of the inadequacy of funding? Is that standard, or are we? What do we have to do to fix this?
That is standard, and I think throwing a large number like that out there makes it seem as though that there's a lot that's being put into things. But what ends up happening is also involved in that funding is the Rcmp. Also involved in that funding is the OPP and larger organizations like this. And what ends up happening is that the smaller Indigenous services, we all end up fighting over the same scraps.
It's also indicated by one expert report that numbers of communities that did want to proceed with Indigenous policing were turned down or couldn't do it because of unavailability of resources. So how do we actually get there from here? How does a community go from being in a particular situation now to actually having an Indigenous police service? How does that process work? Maybe Chief Picard, you could tell us what you think from your perspective in the AFN in Quebec and others.
And we have about 40 seconds to do that.
Way back.
Well, there are a great many implications that arise from this question, but I think, first of all, we have to ensure that we have the proper conditions for the point of departure at square one. If this is what we want to have legislation, a bill, that would recognize that First Nations exercise and will exercise their own jurisdiction in this area.
Leave it there, Mr. Harris. We're now on to the 3-minute rounds. and I have 15 minutes worth of people wanting to ask questions in about 7 minutes. So I'm going to let it run over the clock, but that will effectively mean we'll bump the second set of witnesses down a little bit, unless there's a deep objection to that. That's how I propose to run it, colleagues. With that, Mr. Vidal, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to comment quickly on what an impressive panel of witnesses we've had today. I wish I had 10 or 15 minutes to ask each of you questions, but as you just heard the chair say, I get 3 minutes, so I'm going to focus quite quickly. And so my first question is going to be for President and Chief McCaffrey. Just very impressed by your testimony and your resume, Chief McCaffrey. And I want to talk for a minute about a tribal council in my northern Saskatchewan riding that recently wrote to the Prime Minister asking about the creation of their own police force for the 12 First Nations that they serve. It's called the Prince Albert Grand Council. I would like to just have you offer any advice on frameworks or first steps or best practices that you would share from your vast experience and knowledge that would help them in the establishment of their own service.
Absolutely. My experience with this would be that there would have to be that process. So through the Police Services Act here in Ontario, which currently First Nation policing is not a part of, but we're working on getting us legislated into that, which would allow for us to become essential services. Now, that being said, that would be the first process to ensure that it's written in there how accosting would take place. That it's created a process for a community to step out from, and so in Alberta that would be the Rcmp or Saskatchewan, to be able to step back to say we don't want to be involved in these contract services with the Rcmp. We'd like to start our own police service, and provincially we need your assistance to do this, and that would start those discussions. I've seen it happen with the Treaty 3 Police Service in Northern Ontario. They're the most recent example of this, where they went from 23 officers. Now they're at 90 officers spanning 23 First Nation communities across Northwestern Ontario.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Maybe just a quick question for Chief Picard and Chief Bill, and I don't think it's a difficult or long answer. In your opinion, is the Rcmp too Ottawa-centric? Are they disconnected from the reality of the different local communities across the country?
Very briefly, please. Chief Bill? Your microphone?
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Okay,
fine.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, I would think so. In the north, it's a bit different because the Rcmp are the only law enforcement around. So we, a lot of times, some of the communities, the remote communities, are left unpoliced. They don't have any officers. They don't have any police that they can rely on. And so, the community safety initiatives like this, that's where I see these kinds of programs can help to offset that. One of the things with the Rcmp in terms of its policies, I really feel like the 3 year being stationed in a community for 3 years and then having to leave, or people, get used to some of these officers, and we just get them to a point where we would like to keep them, and then they leave.
Okay, I'm going to have to. I apologize for cutting you off. Mr. Vidal has picked up on the Jack Harris technique of asking a very important question with about 10 seconds left, and then leaving the chair to cut off people, which makes me extremely popular. So. With that, I'm looking for Mr. Sakan. 3 minutes, please. And this is 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. McCaffrey. First of all, I want to thank you for your service, but I also want to pick up on something that you said, that the police force was chronically underfunded or had difficulty accessing resources. And I wanted to ask, how the availability of financial resources affect the police forces in First Nations and Inuit communities in terms of human resources, police facilities, services, and health and safety, please.
Absolutely. The biggest area, obviously, is human resources. The more officers provides the more safety and security for our communities, which ultimately, like we're all aware, is a human right, and which currently our Indigenous communities across Canada do not receive the same safety and security the rest of Canadians do. So I would say that the biggest shortfall when we're talking about funding is exactly that, is human resourcing. And some of it's based on with the factor of population per officer being allotted for a different area. There are different factors that need to be considered in Indigenous communities, like the fact that most of our communities are considered at the highest crime severity index, which means that we are dealing with much higher types of crime, which provides for more specialty type work. So we are developing situations in our detachment where we're creating crime units where we're not funded for those, where I need to create a domestic violence coordinator and we're not funded for those. It's here's your program dollars, figure out how to make it work. And the reason that our officers and that our communities, that our services make it work is because we love our community.
Thank you. And with whatever time I have left,
1 minute.
To Ms. Bill, I represent a riding in the GTA, and I was wondering how you would implement your program in a metropolis.
Well, much like we did here, we started by having a conversation in the community and really building strong partnerships with the City of Whitehorse, the Rcmp, any enforcement agency that had a connection to our community. We reached out to them and really worked on that relationship. And we've made some progress. We still have a ways to go. You know, I'm not going to say everything is perfect, but you do it by building strong relationships and you go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Second. Mr. Uppel, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. And thank you, witnesses, for bringing forward some very important testimony. I will start with Mr. McCaffrey. What strategies should be developed to attract and recruit more young Aboriginals, First Nations into the Rcmp? And I know you touched on this, but I think it's very important that we move forward with this.
I think what a lot of this boils down to is removing barriers. There are a number of barriers that, especially in our Indigenous police services, that we have allowed to remove so that we can attract more and recruit more and be more successful in getting our recruits to the training environments. So that being said, if we're looking to hire for a Northern Ontario community, just the fact of them being able to get testing and to come out from their community to have to go to, say, Thunder Bay, for example, to go and get some testing done, that could be an enormous barrier for somebody that could potentially be a lifelong 30-year officer that would serve your community well. So that being said, if I can just quickly touch on anything, it's at that recruiting level that we need to remove barriers. Other things too, like psychological examinations that are being done, some of them are systemically flawed. Some questions are in there that will put you on the wrong side of the curve immediately. Like, do you see spirits? I've heard that question, right? Well, Indigenous people, they will attend ceremonies and this is a firm belief. So immediately it's systemically flawed in some of those areas, and they need to be looked at in a complete reform to allow for our people to be hired.
Thank you. Now, with all of your experience that you have you been approached by the Rcmp to give advice, or do you know other people who have been?
No, I have not been approached personally from a professional standpoint at this point. I have extended my services like I am today to the commander in Manitoba, as well as I have informal colleagues with the RCMP to share some of these ideas as well, and as well as with a committee with the CACP. So I also sit on the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Policing with Indigenous Peoples. So there is avenues and discussions that are taking place at those levels.
Thank you, Mr. Uppel. Madame Demov, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses. And in 3 minutes, I don't have time to ask you all the questions I'd like to ask, but I would like all of you to give some thought and maybe provide us in writing. How do we ensure that we get enough women applying to be officers in First Nations policing so that we don't make the mistakes of other police services where women are underrepresented? So if you can give some thought, and if all three of you have thoughts on that, if you could provide it to me. Chief Bill, what you're doing in community is a model that I've heard about, and it's a real pleasure and honor to meet you. And I commend you for what you're doing. We've talked a lot about investing more in police. Your model relies on community safety officers. And I'm wondering, are police really the right people to be responding to mental health calls, to be responding to some of these things? Should we be putting more into policing, or should we be putting more into services and individuals who can work in communities to deal with mental health issues and other social issues, as opposed to sending the police to those calls?
I think the CSO program is designed to bridge that gap between the RCMP and the police. The police can't spend a whole lot of time when someone is suicidal or have a mental health breakdown, whereas our CSO's officers can stay with the individual, ensure that individual gets the necessary help that they need, and stay with that individual for whatever amount of time is required. It's incredibly important. In terms of the resources, you know, we're funded by the federal government, Yukon government, and a bit of our own, but we find that it doesn't quite fit anywhere under any particular program because it's not an enforcement body. That's the difficulty that we've had. And I've always said that, you know, government needs to put more resources towards community-based initiatives like this. The RCMP has its role. You know, they have the crime reduction unit here, which is very effective. And that unit goes after drug dealers who are trafficking, drug dealers specifically, not vulnerable people. That should be the RCMP's role. In the community, we can take care of those nuisance calls. We can take care of, you know, our people when they have mental health issues and stuff. In many cases, the CSOs help to de-escalate those types of situations. You know, sometimes people are under incredible stress, and when they see the CSOs, they calm down immediately. And they've saved a number of young women from really unsafe situations. And I think, you know, they're the eyes and ears of the community. And that's what communities need.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Ms.
Chief
Damoff. Madame Michaud, a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go with Mr. Picard without questioning certain ideas. Do you think that there's a real problem of training, of awareness? Do you feel that people don't know Aboriginal culture, so that the approaches were always ill-adapted?
Microphone.
Okay, can you hear me now? Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me now? Yes. So quickly, there's a report that was tabled at the City of Montreal earlier this year, which confirms that indeed there needs to be some awareness. And this led us before the city, through Valérie Plante, the mayor, to tell them that yes, racism and systemic discrimination
are a fact within the Montreal City Police Force. We, a few days ago, we had a conversation with Ms. Plante, and I think it shows the huge gap that separates our community and police forces, municipal police forces, provincial police forces. There's a lot of catching up to do. And it takes, as Mr. McCaffrey was saying earlier, it takes programs that are adapted to raise awareness.
Thank you, Madame. Mr. Harris, the final minute and a half.
Thank you, Chair. Just trying to get my mic on. Yes, I'd like to ask a question to Chief Picard, particular to Quebec. I asked about the OPP relationship with the Indigenous police forces that he's involved in. Is there a similar relationship between the Sûreté de Quebec and tribal or Indigenous police forces in Quebec as well? Does that relationship work well, or is there work to be done that that you think should be undertaken as part of a new type of relationship?
Can you hear me in English?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, no, we certainly would like to have the same kind of relationship as OPP does with a number of tribal organizations in Ontario. But the relationship has been strained somewhat in recent years. I would even go further than that. Since 1990 and the Oka crisis, my colleague this morning referred to that situation, and I say, we have a relationship to build. This is not to say that, some situations where our communities rely on the SQ, where there's not, the harmony, and it is positive, but it's not we can't say the same for all communities. So definitely there's a relationship to be strengthened between the Sûreté du Québec and our communities, especially those that have their own police service. But this being said, all of our communities would like to have that opportunity or that privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. With that, it'll bring our questioning to a close. Just take note that when our parliamentary committee is functioning well, our fourth and final panel today, Dr. Jeffrey Schiffer from Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. Good to see you again, Dr. Schiffer. Akawasi Owusu Bumpa, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, U of T. Now, is that UTSC or is that U of T? Sorry, put your microphone on.
I was muted. It's Mississauga.
Oh, that's too bad.
Now, if you were from Scarborough, you really would be an expert.
Yeah, I'll see myself out then.
Yeah. And Alan Benson, Chief Executive Officer of Native Counseling Services of Alberta. With that, I'll call on Dr. Jeffrey Schiffer for a 7-minute presentation.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some testimony. My name is Jeffrey Schiffer. I'm a Métis person, and as the chair has said, I'm currently the Executive Director of Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. I just want to start by acknowledging the Algonquin territory, which you're all gathered on today, as well as the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe people from which I join you. I applaud you for calling a series of hearings to discuss systemic racism in policing. This is an issue that we can trace back to the very inception of Canada. As you're all aware, our nation is built on treaties. Canada today, in fact, derives its legal status as a nation from treaties. As numerous national commissions and inquiries and reports have noted, the Indigenous signatories of these treaties had very different understandings of the implications of these agreements. Policing in Canada emerged in part as a mechanism to enforce and expand colonization. The Northwest Mounted Police, created in 1873, occupied a central role in managing and containing Indigenous populations as European settlement advanced. They played a central role in relocating Indigenous people to reserve lands established by the Crown, and also removing Indigenous people, children from their families to be placed in residential schools. So for almost 150 years, police in Canada have been utilized to enforce colonial interpretations of the original treaties and to implement Canadian law, which sometimes is not congruent with the vision of a shared nation that was initially promised to Indigenous peoples. So we're at a crossroads today in Canada. As Rcmp Commissioner Brenda Lucki has stated, systemic racism is part of every institution, including the Rcmp. Our national, provincial and territorial, and municipal police services remain ensnared in the historical momentum of the racism and colonial ideologies that framed their creation so long ago. And this is evident in the persistent statistics that reveal Indigenous people being more frequently questioned and investigated by police, more often subject to violence, sexual exploitation, and death at the hands of police, and being starkly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. In an era of truth and reconciliation, these problems are becoming more acute rather than getting better. Just as one example, since April of 2010, the Indigenous population in prisons has grown nearly 44%, whereas the non-Indigenous incarcerated population in Canada has declined almost 14% over that same period. Research tells us that the crossroads that we're at today provides a fleeting opportunity of significant magnitude. The shock that's in our system at present due to COVID-19 and global coordinated protests against systemic racism in policing provides a unique opportunity for change. I believe we have a responsibility as leaders to ensure public safety and national security that's not only evidence-based, but also framed in reconciliation, equity, and what does the data tell us about where police services succeed and where they fail? What possible pathways lay before us for innovation that can lead to better outcomes for Indigenous people across Canada? In May, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, a 29-year-old Black and Indigenous woman, fell to her death from the 24th floor of her apartment when police were responding to a mental health crisis. In June, Chantel Moore, a 26-year-old Indigenous mother, was fatally shot by police during a wellness check. A week later, 48-year-old Rodney Levy, an Indigenous man with a history of struggles with mental health, was shot and killed by the RCMP responding to a call about an unwanted guest at a residence. These 3 deaths are small pieces in a much larger picture. A study released in June revealed that while Indigenous people make up roughly 5% of the population, 38 of the last 100 people killed by police in Canada were Indigenous. In the decade spanning 2007 to 2017, Indigenous people counted for more than a third of people shot to death by Rcmp officers. Mounting evidence is telling a story. It's telling us that police officers are struggling to manage with wellness checks, mental health crisis, and a variety of other calls and interactions, particularly when Indigenous people are involved. Recent studies reveal that typical responses used by police services to address these challenges aren't effective. In assessing data from over 700 private sector establishments between 1971 and 2002, researchers investigated the impacts of police service initiatives in training, promoting inclusion, and establishing institutional responsibility. Of these three strategies, training was found to be the least effective, and while these strategies had some positive impact when deployed together, the research found that systemic racism in policing is driven by a constellation of individual, group, institutional, and social elements. In short, police services may not have the capacity to resolve structural racism themselves. Support from government and community-led organizations will be critical if we're to action the change of seeing better outcomes in this area. Recent calls to defund police are grounded in the evidence-based recognition that some work currently done by police services can be done more effectively with less resources by community-led organizations. For me, it's less about defunding police and more about a thoughtful consideration about how resources might be reallocated to community organizations to take on some of the work related to community safety, mental health response, and victim services for Indigenous people and racialized community. I'd just like to put three recommendations before you before I finish today. First, I'd like to recommend that the federal government work with provinces and territories, municipalities, and Indigenous communities to reallocate funding and service responsibilities related to mental health and victim services to Indigenous organizations. I'd like to recommend that some specific funding be allocated to mental health response and victim services for Indigenous people. And the need is particularly pressing in urban centers like Toronto, where we're seeing massive and rapid growth in our Indigenous community. Finally, I would like to recommend that the federal government create an Indigenous-led working group to better examine the service needs related to mental health and victim services for rapidly growing urban Indigenous communities. And with that, I'd just like to thank the members of the committee for the opportunity to appear as a witness today. I look forward to answering any questions you might have later on. Chimigwich, thank you very much. Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Schiffer. Professor Akwesasi Owusu Bemba, 7 minutes, please.
So I'm Professor Akwasi Owusu Bemba of the University of Toronto, as we've established. I'd like to thank the committee as well for the opportunity to speak before you today, and Dr. Schiffer for his comments. In addition to my own research on issues of race and policing, I've worked in operational police policy and indirectly and directly with police agencies on matters relating to race, racism, and questions of equity. I've interviewed and surveyed members of the general public on their perceptions of and experiences with racism in policing, and conducted similar interviews and research with populations most subject to police attention. I've also spent a considerable amount of time conducting research with and working with racialized officers on issues that they face in the policing world. And so my comments today reflect not only my academic research, but also these professional and practical experiences. I think it's important in the context of the discussion we're having today to talk about some definitional issues. We're talking about systemic racism here, and I think it's wise to think about differences between structural, systemic, and institutional racism, each of which is relevant in the Canadian context. From my perspective, when I'm thinking about issues of systemic racism in policing, I actually think more about structural racism, which describes a system in which policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations and other norms work in varied and often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial inequality. And the key part here is that structural racism acknowledges the role that our history and culture have played in creating a social system that privileges whiteness over non-whiteness. Rather than looking at individual institutional practices, structural racism understands racism as being embedded in the fabric of our social, economic, and political systems. Institutional racism refers to institutional policies and practices that intentionally or not produce outcomes that constantly favor or disadvantage certain groups over others. Now, we see structural racism play out in policing when we consider why it is that certain racial groups come into contact with the police more frequently than others, just by virtue of who they are and where they live. Racism in various sectors of our society influences the nature of police work, of course. Most members of our society would expect a heightened police presence in areas where crime is higher. If Black and Indigenous people suffer racial discrimination in employment and education sectors, thus increasing levels of poverty and the likelihood that they live in disadvantaged neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and violence, it follows that these people will have greater exposure to the police, and by extension, police stop and search practices, arrest, use of force, etc. So we see structural racism, for example, play out when we look at arrests for minor drug offenses. Evidence from Canada and other jurisdictions suggests that members of different racial groups use drugs at relatively similar rates, yet we see stark racial differences in drug possession arrests. While some of these differences can likely be attributed to officer behavior and institutional policies and practices, the heightened police presence in the lives of Black and Indigenous people also plays an important role. So much remedy here lies outside of the realm of policing. It's my belief that the government should follow the call by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police to first decriminalize and later legalize and regulate other substances. This would take the need for the police to address these minor issues away from them. From my perspective, an example of institutional racism in policing would include the privileging of enforcement-oriented forms of policing over community policing efforts in performance reviews and consideration for promotion. If officers are evaluated on the number of arrests that they make, rather than the extent to which they build strong ties with communities, then officers will be inclined to make arrests, warranted or not, rather than engaging in other activities which may serve to engender public safety. So efforts to increase arrests are likely to involve going after low-hanging fruit, often minor infractions in higher crime neighborhoods, and again, racial differences in housing patterns and the greater presence of certain racial groups amongst those experiencing poverty, combined with the presence of racial stereotypes in our society, will converge to produce racially disparate outcomes. Now, of course, there's overlap between structural, systemic, and institutional racism, and I have no doubt in the 2 minutes I've been speaking, or 3, I've confused some of you. I'm happy to follow up later on. A proportion of Canadians believe that racism is a feature of Canadians. The third in a series of studies examining racial differences in perceptions of the police in the Greater Toronto Area. We find that between 60 and 80% of Black, white, and Asian people in the Greater Toronto Area feel that there's discrimination in policing. And I know that similar studies have been conducted across the country with similar, although perhaps not quite as extreme results. My own work demonstrates that these perceptions, these negative perceptions stem from both personal and vicarious experiences. My own work demonstrates that Black people more than white people feel that they've been mistreated by the police during their last encounter, that the police were disrespectful, and that their interactions lacked what we would call procedural justice. We have evidence on differences in terms of treatment after the stops as well. Research conducted recently by my colleague, Kanika Samuels-Wortley from Carleton University, shows differences in police discretion, and in particular, the extent to which young racialized people are offered diversion programs. We know that diversion is offered to white youth to a greater extent than it is to Black and to Indigenous youth. I won't go into police use of force at great depth because that's been covered, but we know, similar to the Indigenous situation, for example, in Toronto, Black people are not only much more likely to be the recipients of police use of force, but they're also subject to greater force. So, for example, in shootings, there are many more shots fired by the police than when the individual is white, and the threshold for using that force is lower. I would suggest, or I'd argue, that we need a national database that captures police use of force incidents. We do not know the full extent to which the police are using force at the moment because this data is not systematically collected by our policing agencies and thus not made available to the government, to policymakers, and to researchers like myself. I think it's important that we look at the experiences of racialized officers themselves. Many police services across the country have made great efforts to increase the diversity of their workforce, and I mean diversity in terms of what officers look like. But unfortunately, my own research tells me that racialized officers do not feel that they are taken into the police subculture and brought into the police brotherhood. And I use the term brotherhood there purposefully. They're overlooked for task and area assignments and too often passed over for promotion. I'm going to finish by stating that a full examination of the extent to which individual, institutional, and systemic or structural racism impacts upon Canadian policing is not possible without access to racially disaggregated police data. And this data must extend beyond key indicators such as stops and searches and arrests to include information about the outcome of police activity. So hit rates from stops, the number of charges that are dropped by the Crown. And we need information on the experiences of racialized officers. I commend the Association of Chiefs of Police and Statistics Canada for announcing that they will be collecting race-based policing data, but that must be comprehensive data. If it is just cursory data, the data collected will very easily be used to further stigmatize already stigmatized groups and could lead to the creation of further marginalizing policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Professor Owusu-Bempah. With that, our final witness is Mr. Benson. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee for the invite. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the clerk and his office for all the work going into setting this up. I appreciate it. I am a member of the Beaver Lake First Nations in Treaty 6 territory, and I want to acknowledge that territory I'm on. I was reminded yesterday by a priest and an elder that while I'm on Zoom meetings, I should acknowledge that I'm in the creator space, so I'll do that. So I'm also the president of the National Association Active in Criminal Justice, and as of Monday, past chair of the Family Violence Death Review Committee in Alberta. I have experience working in Australia, implementing some of the recommendations from the Woods Inquiry into that the RCMP actually assisted the government of Australia in that inquiry, and was heavily involved in community engagement while I worked for the Premier of New South Wales. I'm also at present the facilitator for dialogue with the Alberta Chiefs. Last week we had a meeting with our provincial justice minister and 4 federal ministers, including Minister Blair, and another member of Parliament, Pam, actually was there. And so I'm going to speak from all of that experience on a number of different topics, and I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. Rather than read my notes, I'm going to just highlight some of the key things. The first I'd like to talk about is more around the use of force. Being involved in many investigations, reviews, where police complaints against the police that have come through my office, I'd like to speak about the criminal code. Section 25 of the code allows law enforcement to use force in the course of their duty. And Section 26 makes it a crime for police to use excessive force. However, the definition of what is reasonable use of force is very vague. And because of that, provincial police forces, municipal police forces have their own legal framework. So there's not a consistency across the country. And that creates a challenge. So we need to review the various definitions of reasonable use of force and create a federal standard that's incorporated not just in the criminal code, but the National Police Act. The clearer definition of understanding what use of force is very important. The standard needs to be created with the input from civilians, from women, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and many other minorities across this country. That input is very important. The video of Chief Adam Adams being taken down is a good example of how the police can review the tapes and determine that reasonable force was used. According to their standard, reasonable force was used. While most Albertans and Canadians decreed that use of force was excessive, the definition of reasonable needs to resonate with police and civilians. A review of these incidents from the perspective of an independent process, municipal, provincial, and federal police services need a more independent body that reviews complaints and reports to municipal, provincial, and federal government. Historically and currently, the work of the Police Complaints Commission for Rcmp has not made a substantive change in the way in which Indigenous people experience police services nationally. The Commission needs to be more inclusive, more accessible, and more transparent with the ability to impose sanctions in some cases. It needs to be accessible. The current processes are complicated and difficult to navigate for many Canadians. All Canadians need to be able to understand and access this process for complaints. Their complaints need to be taken and addressed in respectful ways. They need to be meaningful and engaged, where Indigenous participation in the entire independent review process. This means including Indigenous leadership on the team, the commission, Indigenous expertise in decision-making processes and positions, and hire Indigenous investigators. The review body needs to be comprised of Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and other minorities that have a broad expertise along with other Canadians in policing and social justice. Transparency. The independent review process needs to be detailed and be made available to Canadians with few exceptions. These exceptions need more clarity. Clear consequences. The consequences of excessive use of force, racism, and abuse of power need to be meaningful and transparent to the public. Investigative bodies must be able to recommend sanctions in some cases and have the authority to impose these sanctions. From a First Nations police point of view, and I'm going to speak about my interaction with the chiefs and federal provincial ministers and recent follow-up with the chiefs, there needs to be a more equitable and consistent funding for self-administered First Nation police services. These services must be recognized as essential services, as are other police forces in federal and provincial legislation. Inherent to this funding is a negotiation of an agreement with First Nations that recognize the right of First Nations to police their communities or negotiate the delivery of police services by the Rcmp or in some cases by provincial authorities. Further, the chiefs in Alberta region have requested direct negotiations and involvement in the development of any policies, legislation around First Nation policing, as well as criminal justice reform. I'd like to just make a reference to the Siksika Nation. On that nation, there are 8,000 people, approximately 8,000. The hamlet next to Siksika has a population of just over 200 people. The police detachment is located in that hamlet of 200 people. They have 20 officers. Those 20 officers provide police services, very little police services, but police services nonetheless to Siksika First Nations. The question of everybody in that whole region is, why isn't that detachment on the reserve and serving the biggest population of the whole region? That's just one example of many challenges around policing from outside the community.
Well, we're going to have to, unfortunately, Mr. Benson, leave it there. Time is a tyranny here. And with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Vidal for the 6 minutes round. We start the 6 minute round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I again want to just make the comment I made earlier that we've had such an impressive round of witnesses all day today, and I just want to express our appreciation to each of them for taking the time and making the effort to come and share your knowledge and experience with us. I want to start with Dr. Awasu Bempa. Would you please comment on the pace of the federal government's implementation of various reports tabled on policing, racism, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls?
In choosing my words carefully, I would call it almost glacial. I say that I think there have been appear to be efforts made to stem progress in some senses, and I'm not seeing that progress made in the actions of the membership at the federal level of policing. And so while there are numerous initiatives, whether that be hiring, whether that be in community consultation and the likes, that are intended to, ameliorate many of the problems that have been discussed by the speakers, including myself just now. I don't think we're seeing the same in terms of action with respect to how members of the public are being treated. It's my general sense.
Thank you for that. I'm going to follow up with you with one more question before I move on. We've talked a lot today, or I've asked some questions about good relationships and how they're vital in order to build good policing policy or good community. In your opinion, what are the top priorities that the RCMP could, I mean, I'm talking like work on this summer, like get right to work on in order to improve relationships with various communities throughout the country?
So I think the most important thing to consider when we think about relationship building between the police and the communities that they serve is that you can spend countless hours trying to foster good relations, and all it takes is one high-profile case of abuse to undo all of that work. That's the reality. How do I think things could be made? What progress could be made in the immediate? I would like to see a clear signal from the commissioner on exactly how systemic racism, as she now understands it, is going to be addressed, and that begin to be rolled out over the summer, right? I think many of us in the academic world, as well as others watching, were quite shocked, given, again, all of the recommendations that have been made and all of the talk around addressing issues of, and I say diversity because diversity is often used, and I think we need to recognize that issues of racism or gender discrimination, which are different from issues of discrimination for sexual orientation. But the fact that in 2020, the commissioner of the RCMP could not articulate what systemic racism is has done nothing to appear to the public that the service is doing something to address systemic racism. So I think a statement with clear plans on how that's going to be dealt with. And again, that needs to be internally and externally, pardon me. So not only...
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président, on n'a pas aucune traduction depuis quelques minutes.
Publicly facing, but also...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. We don't have interpretation.
Okay, if you could just hold that for a second.
Sure.
Fixing translation, if Professor Awasabemba, if you could move a little closer to your microphone. Sure. Apparently there's
yeah, okay. Very loud. Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit of a problem. Okay, are we good with translation? Yes? Is that a yes, or is that a yes or no?
Oui, ça va.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, so okay, we'll start again.
So table a plan to address excessive use of force, table a plan to address the release of race-based data, which the RCMP has been reluctant to release, and address the community relations strategy, and recognize again that one high-profile case of police abuse is going to undo good work that's done.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Dr. Schiffer to answer the same question. I think I'm going to be able to squeeze in the rest of my questions, so if you would, and then I'll get to my next question.
Same question about actions that could be immediately taken.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. Yes.
Fantastic. So as my colleague just said, I mean, a world of community relations can be taken down by one negative case. And what we are seeing, particularly in the Indigenous community, is that a lot of the cases that go wrong are when we have law enforcement officers trying to intervene around mental health crisis. And what we do know is that the intergenerational relationship between Indigenous people and law enforcement impacts an interaction before it has already started. We also know that law enforcement officers, whether they're with the RCMP or the police, don't have a lot of training in de-escalation around mental health, and certainly not training and support that's Indigenous specific. I think taking some of these problem areas where the police services struggle and shifting them over to community-based organizations that already know how to do that well would remove the possibility of those interactions going wrong, and limit the amount of times that we would see those emerging. So I do think that a thoughtful consideration about where police services are struggling and our capacity to empower community-led groups to take on some of that work would make significant change.
You have less than a minute.
Thank you. I think you've left me just enough time to ask Dr. Benson a question as well. So Dr. Benson, Dr. Schiffer actually alluded to it in his answer, but could you just talk briefly about the quality of training for officers when facing cases of mental health?
Well, right now in reviewing what there needs to be some changes. There's a lot of there are a lot of new research and new programs that are available for professionals in the addressing mental health, especially around the intervention field. So I think there needs to be a review of the training that's there now and updated.
Thanks very much, Mr. Vidal. Madame Demoff, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses who are here. I'm actually going to start with Dr. Schiffer. Dr. Schiffer, you and I have talked about a pilot. I know you were involved in the development of the Quanlin Dunn model of the community safety officers. And we haven't talked a lot about the urban context for Indigenous peoples because we know most Indigenous peoples actually live in urban settings. And I know you're working on a model that would put community safety officers in settings where they're interacting with Indigenous peoples. And certainly that model could also be translated over to Black Canadians and in urban settings as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So a few years ago, I did lead the Office of Indigenization at the Justice Institute of British Columbia, which is responsible for training every municipal police officer in the province of British Columbia. During my time there, I did have the opportunity to support the development of the Quanlin Dunn First Nation Community Safety Officer Program. That program has received a lot of media attention and has been really positively received in the community, not only seeing a sharp reduction in the call of police officers, but building positive relationships and also attending to a lot of the sort of cultural stuff that I've been talking to. So we know, and you know, those officers weren't strictly speaking, they were not police officers. They were community safety officers. But when we were building the curriculum for that program, we said, what are the needs in this community? Well, we know this community is struggling with mental health challenges. We know that that needs to be de-escalated through particular means. And when I think about the 7,000 unique individuals that we support every year in the city of Toronto at Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, I know that many of them have very negative impacts with policing. And I just referred to a study in my testimonial earlier, and it was a study that was done out of the States, but really showed that about $8 billion is spent every year in the States on police training, and that training has not been shown to change behavior in officers, right? So training in itself is something that does not work unless it's deployed with a number of other structural changes. And so we've been working on a pilot at Native Child in collaboration with the community and partners here to look at what it would be like to put you know, safety officers that are specialized in victim services and mental health to be first responders, to be able to work with and de-escalate some of the situations that often go wrong with police. We do know that police will need to be involved some of the time, but I do think that we could take a number of these cases off the hands of the Toronto Police Service. And what that does as well is free up officers for more critical tasks that they often struggle to find time to address, right? So I think it's supporting police officers to really focus on the things that they do well, while also making room for community-led solutions that we know lead to better results.
So as we're talking about systemic racism in policing, and there's been a lot of talk about funding, do you think that we should be putting funding into these types of resources rather than funding more police, funding resources that can deal with mental health, addiction, sexual assaults, domestic violence? Police are not necessarily the best people to be supporting those individuals who are the victims of crime.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to put some thoughtful consideration into what police do well, because we need them in our society, and there are many things that they do very well, but there are also other things that they're just not set up to do and aren't trained for, and we can pour tons of money into trying to get them set up to do that in a good way and effectively, and that's been the strategy, but that strategy has not been successful. We've seen through pilots like Quanlin Dunn that when we shift the focus to community-led programs that deal with some of the things like mental health and victim services, family violence and things like that, we spend less money and we get much better results. And this has been done in reserved communities, but it has not been done in any substantial way in Canadian urban centers. And when we think about the shifting Indigenous demographics, with the vast majority of Indigenous people living in Indigenous communities, I think we have a real opportunity here to fund some pilots that will lead to real innovation and quite frankly, save lives, because Indigenous people are dying in cities like Toronto when these interactions go wrong.
Dr. Benson, first I want to thank you for your 40 years of advocacy and work. You really are it's a real, I really enjoy working with you and the knowledge that you have. When you and I spoke, you were talking about two things that need to change with the RCMP. One is oversight and the other is discipline. And you spoke a bit about the oversight piece, but you didn't speak a lot about how both of those need to be done in tangent in order to make changes in the RCMP. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Thank you. So that was the last piece of my talk, was around consequence. You know, we've acknowledged in a number of cases where our organization's been directly involved with the RCMP in managing and dealing with complaints over the many years. Where consequences occurred, we saw change in the community relations. It was more transparent in the community. In the Woods inquiry with the New South Wales Police, where consequences were developed and addressed and it became a public document, I think that a lot of change happened right after that point, where we saw a police establishment wanting to engage better with the community and looking for better ways of doing business. There were more training implemented with the police. So I think consequences are important. In all matters of our society, there has to be consequences for wrongdoing. I think the challenge we have around that is that there's not enough clarity about the use of force, and it's not consistent across the country.
Okay, thank you for that, Madame Damoff. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes.
Madame Michaud, 6 minutes. Thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for their presentations. My question is for Mr. Owusu. You've made an important distinction between systemic racism and institutional racism. There has been a lot of systemic racism since the outset, of course. Recommendations have been made to correct it. Do you think that that is going to correct both systemic and institutional racism, or do they have to be treated separately? Thank you so much for your question. It didn't work? Can you not hear the English interpretation? Okay. I was on the English channel. Can you not hear the English interpretation? Is the interpretation working?
I don't have it coming through for me.
Okay, so if it's not coming through for the witness, then we better go back to square one. Yes,
Mr. Chair, I think Professor Owusu-Bempah might not have his microphone on the English channel.
Do you want to just check that, Professor Owusu? Because there's a little global thing at the bottom.
I was not, sorry, I didn't have that. Nope, you're correct. I wasn't alerted to that beforehand.
Thank you for Mr. Fergus, who's spent way too much Zoom time and knows.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So let's
the question. Sorry about that.
Let's go back to square one here, and we'll just restart the clock.
I'll start over again then. So, Mr. Owusu, you drew a very necessary distinction between institutional and systemic racism. We have talking about systemic racism since the outset of our work. We want to make recommendations. But do you think that there is a difference between the two concepts? Should it be a strategy where the two forms of racism should be dealt with separately, or should they be dealt with together to correct both of them?
So thank you for that question. I think there's an important distinction between perhaps institutional racism and then definitely structural racism. We can put systemic with institutional or with structural, but there are various forms of inequality present in our society, as I said at the outset, that lead to policing outcomes that produce racially disparate outcomes in policing. So as I said, discrimination in education and employment creates an environment in which the police, even if they're acting impartially or in an unbiased manner, are likely to produce outcomes with a racially differential impact. And given that the police are state agents, I think that that needs to be considered in the context of the work that you're doing. Is it fair that just because of where I live or my experiences with poverty that I'm more likely to be criminalized for doing something that my peers who are more privileged are not criminalized for doing? And then we need to I think you should look at and examine institutional policies and practices within policing that also produce racially disparate outcomes, which again may on the surface seem race neutral. So the practice of police street checks, for example, and importantly, as I mentioned at the outset, using various things like street checks or even arrests as a performance measure. Some of the risk assessment tools or the way in which release decisions are made when we consider, whether or not an individual has a fixed address, can post bail. There are various institutional practices within policing that produce racially disparate outcomes and various phenomenon in our society that the police have to address that also produce racially disparate outcomes. And I think that both need to be examined in the context of the work that you're doing, because if we just focus on what the police are doing themselves without considering what's happening in the society in which they work, we are still going to have, the high rates of use of force and violence inflicted upon Black and Indigenous people are a product of institutional practices, but they're also a product of societal practices. And this is why Dr. Schiffer is talking about, detasking. So having the more we can remove the presence of police from the lives of marginalized people in instances that they don't need to be there, the less likely we are to have these negative outcomes.
Merci.
Thank you. And when you talk about these different concepts that are certainly very important, I think about education that has to be assured. Also, intersectionality. I learned in a intersectionality at university in political science and in elsewhere. Do you think that concept of intersectionality should be made clear to police in the training that they receive?
Absolutely, because my experience as a relatively light-skinned African Canadian with a high level of education and a fairly high income is going to make my experiences with the police, although I would tick a box Black, different from my father, who was much darker, had an accent, right, and lived in very different circumstances than myself, which would be different again from a young Indigenous female that might be different from an elderly Asian female. And this is, I do an exercise in my inequality and criminal justice class on exactly that. So intersectionality is important. None of us come into the world, with just one identity. There are multiple aspects to our identity. And when it comes to experiences of oppression for many, the axes of oppression are multiple and they're overlapping. And so again, when we think about the fact that racism in our society increases problems of mental health, then we've got the intersection of race and mental health that is very prevalent. And when we see, for example, the deaths of many African Americans in the Toronto area, of course, they've been called because of mental illness. So yes, it should be examined.
1 minute.
Merci.
Thank you. You spoke about, Statistics Canada announced that it was going to collect data on the race of victims of criminal acts and those who are accused also of criminal acts and the incidents of use of force by police. Do you think Statistics Canada should go further in collecting this type of data than it has done in the past?
On the race data specifically, yes, I do. And it has been collecting some from police agencies that will provide that data to them. Others have a policy not to provide the data. But again, going to your intersectionality point, the more data that we can collect, the better. I understand that's not always practical in the context of the work that the police are doing. But again, I think we will, although I've advocated for the collection of race-based data now for the better part of a decade and a half, if we don't do it properly, it could be quite dangerous.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. Mr. Harris, 7 minutes or 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I want to echo Mr. Vidal's point that we have an impressive group of witnesses, not only in this panel but all day, and it's good that we were able to hear your experience and your knowledge. Professor Asaku Bempa, let me ask you first. You gave a detailed description of the difference between structural racism, systemic racism, institutional racism, and I think I get it after listening carefully. One of the problems that we have as politicians in talking to a variety of people, including police officers, retired police officers, RCMP officers, they feel that when we're talking about systemic racism, that they're being accused of racists, as being racist, and being called a racist in our society, of course, is a very negative thing. Is there a simple way of getting through to the people who feel that they're under threat and under being called out, just in general, of saying to them what needs to be said to have them understand that they could be part of the solution, or that they were stuck with being part of the problem?
Yeah. So just to clarify, my name is Owusu Bempa.
I'm sorry.
We're going to address issues around diversity and equity. I think I should make that clear. No, don't apologize. There are a lot of syllables there. Your point is very, very well taken. And we saw this in the United Kingdom when McPherson released his report that noted that the London Met Police were institutionally racist. And even though the word institution is in the term, police officers took that as the front to the work that they do. And I think providing clear examples of the way in which, if we're going to talk about institutional racism, that seemingly race-neutral practices and policies have a racially disparate impact can be a clear way of demonstrating that to officers, right? A lot of the work that's done now focuses on implicit bias, and I think that's more comfortable for officers because it takes the responsibility away. But if clear demonstrations of how a practice, when applied equally or appearing to be applied equally, still produces racially disparate outcomes can be demonstrated to police officers, I think they will do a better job of accepting how institutional racism, for example, impacts upon policing. And I would suggest the same would be true for structural racism too.
Oh, thank you. And I think your example of the reward system within policing in terms of recognizing number of arrests versus various other ways of resolving incidents does reflect on that too, because it forces police officers down a particular path that they perhaps don't even realize that they're being directed towards. So I think some of these examples are quite useful. We also, I'm very conscious, and one of the reasons I was so keen to have this whole study go forward is that we are at a point. You say you've been working for a decade and a half on some of these issues, in particular data and whatnot. We are at a point as a result of well-known current events where there is an opportunity to seize the opportunity to try and implement some systemic solutions to what we are recognizing as a systemic problem. And it's encouraging that 85% of Canadians see it as a systemic problem, particularly in policing. It's kind of a version of the question Mr. Vidal asked. Are there specific systemic solutions that are practical to see happening? You talk about national statistics, and you had fairly granular expectations in terms of what was expected. Is there a practical way of instituting that at a national level? What mechanism would there be? Is StatsCan the role way, or is there should be some other national standard or national law that would compel this?
Yep. So this should most definitely be standardized using standardized racial descriptors. The province of Ontario recently, as part of the Anti-Racism Act, put forth data standards, which I think provide a good model. And what would need to happen is simply a box on the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports, for example, that would capture race. And so the racial categories that would be utilized, there are about a dozen in Ontario, would make their way onto the forms and into the databases that police use and collect. And I should note that although this is not done in a systematic fashion at the moment, we know from all of the attention to police carding that the police have been, across this country, collecting racial information on the people that they come into contact with. What we don't have is that done in any kind of uniform fashion. And what we don't have is that being done throughout the different work that police do, and it's not reported to Statistics Canada. So from my perspective, that would take a little bit of computer programming to ensure that the databases were proper and the changing of fields in those databases and the forms used. It's a relatively simple, you say relatively purposely, thing to do.
Jack, you've got your microphone on, or off.
Someone turned it off. Maybe me. Is that a province by province issue, Professor Bempa? Is that, or is that something that can be done nationally?
So it can be done nationally in that, like, the Uniform Crime Reporting System is a system of reporting, like, information on criminal incidents to Statistics Canada that 99% of police agencies currently use. So the whole purpose of that is that all police agencies across the country are sending, it's called uniform data to Statistics Canada. So it's simply a matter of updating that information to capture race. What is different is some of the other forms of information that the police capture. So when we talk about carding or street checks, although there were similar forms used, this is information that's collected about individuals that the police come into contact with. Not necessarily when there's been an incident, but when they want to collect information about an individual. There's less uniformity in that sense. Many people would argue that practice, though, should be eradicated, and that's what we see in Ontario, is not the eradication of street checks or carding, but their heavy regulation, so that the numbers have come down substantially.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. Harris. Thank you very much. Mr. Berthold, 3 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Professor Owusu-Bempah. It shows in your speech you were able to see what's done elsewhere in the world in terms of interaction between racialized Aboriginal communities and police forces. Are there any countries that should be used as an example, or will Canada have to build from scratch a new system, a new way of doing things with racialized groups and Aboriginal communities?
So that is an excellent question. I would like to hear from some of the other speakers on this. My sense is that we wouldn't necessarily be able to take a model that's been developed in any one nation. We would have to pick pieces of practice from specific policing agencies, for example. So we heard about the example of basically the community support officers. That model that was developed on the West Coast also been implemented in the United States and shown great promise, a reduction in use of force, and actually when non-armed and semi-uniformed individuals are doing patrols, they still have a similar deterrent effect. So that's a good practice. The Las Vegas Police Department, for example, instituted a policy several years ago mandating officers, to the extent that they could, if they engaged in a pursuit, that they would not engage in use of force, because we know that their sympathetic nervous system was up, their adrenaline was rushing, and they were more likely to use more force. Their officers also undergo 100 hours of de-escalation training. So there are models and there are best practices, but as I've said, there's no one jurisdiction, a national jurisdiction, I would say, that we could borrow from. What we need to do is find the best practices from individual jurisdictions.
You have 1 minute left.
Monsieur Schiffer.
Mr. Schiffer, would you also comment or answer my question?
I would agree with what's already been said, and I can really only comment around Indigenous peoples, but I would say that, each First Nation, along with Métis and Inuit people, have very long traditions of justice and public safety within their own cultures. For thousands of years before contact, they had systems established to maintain community safety and wellness and address crime in their communities. And I think that we have some good models there that are still alive and well within the knowledge base of Indigenous people that can be brought into the contemporary scenario to develop things. And so, and that's what we did with Kwalin-Dun, drawing from the example in the Yukon from the Kwalin-Dun First Nation. I think where it gets more complex is in urban Canada, when we have large urban Indigenous populations that are very diverse, right? we are serving maybe 80 or 90 different First Nations at any given time in the city of Toronto, and there's a lot of complexity there. And that's why we focus on community engagement and building these programs in collaboration, co-developing them, in fact, with the communities that they're intended to serve.
Thank you, Mr. Berthold. Madame Cara, I just say to the Liberals on the panel that no one's indicated to me who the next Liberal speaker is. So if I could get that information, it'd be helpful. So with that, Madame Cara.
Thank you, Chair. And I believe it's Gary Nandasangri who's going to be the next speaker. Once again, I do want to, let everyone know it's truly been a compelling testimony from all our witnesses. So thank you for being here and for your testimony. Professor Owusu Bempah, I do want to talk to you a bit more on the race-based data. We know race-based data collection within policing could be extremely helpful for improving public accountability and informing police policies and practices such as the use of force. Recently Stats Can, said that we'll now begin to collect data on race of victims and victims of crime and also people accused of crime. I proudly represent one of the most diverse communities and marginalized communities in the country in my riding of Brampton West, and I've certainly heard about the importance of collecting race-based data. So I'd like to perhaps touch a bit more on why that's so significant. But if you could also talk a bit more on any of the considerations on how we collect that data, how is it used, and certainly concerns on privacy or ensuring that it is not used to further tarnish the community or to reinforce any racist stereotypes. I know you alluded to that earlier. So if you can perhaps shed some light on how we balance that, that would be really helpful for the community, and perhaps what more needs to be done within the Rcmp in terms of race-based data collection. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So on the whole, I see the benefits of race-based data collection allowing us to first and foremost develop a more comprehensive picture of how members of different racial groups experience policing. The data can be useful for identifying racial disparities in policing outcomes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean discrimination. As I've said, there are a variety of factors within our society that increase the likelihood that members of certain racial groups are going to come into contact with the police and perhaps engage in crime. But it could also be useful for identifying areas of discrimination. So as I've said, issues related to contact with the child welfare system, studies from BC showing children who come into contact with child welfare are more likely to come into contact with the justice system than they are to graduate high school. So we can start to connect the experiences through social institutions so that rather than simply looking at policing as a problem area, we can look at solutions before we get to the area of policing. But we can also identify potential discrimination, as I've said, in policing outcomes. I said the stops as well as the arrests. It seems that the threshold for initiating a stop with African Americans in the United States, for example, is lower. Likewise, the threshold for effecting an arrest, so that when we look at what we would call the hit rates or the success rates for finding contraband, weapons, drugs, is lower with Black individuals than it is with white individuals, because the police are, again, using a lower threshold. And so that's where we can look at practices. Likewise with arrests. If we see, for example, that for every 10 white people arrested, 8 of those cases go to trial versus 2 for Black people, and the Crown decided to drop the charges in 6 of those cases of Black people, then we might start to look at should those charges have been laid in the first place, right? If the Crown deems there not to have been enough evidence. So these are the types of things that we can start to do. As I said, it does need to be comprehensive so that we have, we're not just looking at the rates of stop and search. How do we
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Cara.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to cut people off, but we are well over time. Yep. Mr. Morrison, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and a great conversation today all day. My question is for Ellen Benson. Ellen, you've got an extensive background, and I'm really curious about some demographic issues and what's happening in the last 20 years, and really what you, with your experience, what you see happening in the future with either urbanization or rural communities.
Well, I think a couple of things. I've seen some real change where municipalities, First Nations, and Métis settlements have engaged in Alberta in some real conversations around community safety, rural crime, and partnering around some of the service delivery issues around mental health and addiction. So I've seen changes occurring that we haven't seen in a long time, and that was primarily driven by the Canadian Federation of Municipalities over the last couple of years. On the municipal level, I think we have some real challenges. The challenges in Edmonton, I'll use that as an example. We have trained 1,400 city police officers on historic and intergenerational trauma. We've seen some real changes occur. We've just yesterday had the senior deputies at my office for a discussion around carding. And so we have seen changes around community with the police at the municipal level. The problem we have really is when we have incidents of abuse by police officers, and another one yesterday in Edmonton, it just tears apart all of the building that occurs. And our speakers earlier spoke about this, and we think that engaging the community at other levels is very important, like addressing mental health together and not having officers have to respond to these things. As past chair of the Family Violence Death Review, we see a lot of these challenges. When we had family violence experts intervene, we had less charges, less arrests, less accusations of abuse as well. So we've actually seen death reductions where there's better intervention outside of the police. And that's important to recognize. And I think the other is that, you know, we had an Rcmp cadet program that was initiated by a couple of Rcmp officers with the largest First Nations in Canada, the Hobbema First Nations, which includes 4 bands. That program has been expanded in sort of smaller centers and now is being looked at as an urban strategy where we engage minorities in working with police officers on this cadet strategy. That's real community engagement.
Okay, we're going to, unfortunately, it seems Dr. Benson, I end up cutting you off way too many times. Sorry, Mr. Morrison, we're going to have to leave it there. With that, we're going to ask Mr. Anand-Sangri. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate all the witnesses today. I'm going to try to leave some time for Mr. Secan, but you know, this question really is for Professor Awasabimpa. The issue of representation is quite important. We see some transformation taking place. Peel, City of Toronto, now City of Ottawa, police services are led by racialized individuals, and I think within this service itself, there are more people who are getting into the system. How important is it? Is that the solution, and what more needs to be there to change the structures as opposed to individuals?
So this is a very good question. I think that what we would term a representative bureaucracy may be good to help improve perceptions of the police and also perhaps to facilitate good community relations, providing that those racialized officers are policing communities that they're familiar with. And I know that a study from a few years ago with the Rcmp found, for example, that Black officers were being taken from Toronto and you know, after Depot and placed in Nova Scotia to communities they had no familiarity with. But racialized officers are most definitely not the silver bullet, and even when they make it to the top of the services that they work for, evidence from the United States, for example, demonstrates that in some jurisdictions, African Americans are likely to be shot by African American police officers than white police officers because those African American officers are deployed to African American areas. And so again, we need to look at the larger structural issues that cause many of the problems that we're talking about. And unfortunately, racialized officers still have to go out and operate in a society in which there are a number of social problems that lead members of the communities they may represent into contact with the police.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to yield my time to Mr. Secan.
Yes, 1 minute.
I'd like to continue along that line of thought because, you know, here in Mississauga, we have a minority that's our police chief, which is awesome, Police Nish. In Toronto, although he just retired, we had a police chief that was of color as well. However, my concern is that once they take that uniform off, things are very different for them. And even with that uniform on, there's probably people in their ranks that perhaps don't necessarily abide or obey their power per se if they're perpetrating these things to Canadians. So if you could just continue of how we could do a better job of actually dismantling any kind of systematic discrimination.
It's an extraordinarily complicated question that you have 13 seconds
20
to
seconds.
answer.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Gary.
It's important to examine the culture of policing and the way that informal social networks within policing continue to privilege white officers at the expense of non-white officers. Hockey and golf and who you drink beers with makes a huge difference as to your experiences as a police officer and your levels of success, and that needs to be closely examined.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Madame Michaud, 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Schiffer. We talked about training earlier. You told us that you were doubtful. You doubted the efficiency of training. What would you suggest? What alternative model would you propose? What could the federal government put into place?
So I do think that training is important and it is effective, but it's not effective when that's the only strategy that's utilized. There are some studies that have shown that if you're going to put all your eggs in the basket of training, you shouldn't expect to yield much results. So yes, more training. I heard one of my colleagues mention how there's been some training already done about intergenerational trauma. That sort of stuff is very important, but I think it needs to be accompanied by many of the other things we've been talking about. Focuses on recruiting diverse officers, focuses on increasing accountability, and some of the larger structural shifts that we've been talking about in terms of changing systems in ways that will lead to better results. I think the problem with training is that sometimes it's an easy solution. We think that if we bring in some training to a bunch of officers, they're going to start acting differently. And what the research is telling us is that that's simply not the case. It needs to be paired with other strategies.
Thank you, Madame Michaud. Mr. Harris, the final 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the panelists' views on the issue of police training. We've heard, obviously, evidence that from the Rcmp depot of 6 months training. Was suggested earlier this afternoon that the training is 13 weeks in Ontario. I know some requirements are diplomas in police studies, etc., as part of the training taking several years. Would each of you just comment briefly on that? Well, each of you couldn't comment briefly on it, but let's say start with Professor Owusu Bempah. Would you give us your views on that?
Your microphone.
Less training needs to focus on officers' ability to swim and to use their firearms and to engage in high-speed pursuits, and more needs to focus on de-escalation and how to interact with members of the public.
Thank you. Mr. Brenson, would you have a comment on that?
I agree. I think that the other point is that we need to be able to be more inclusive around understanding mental health and fight or flight that comes from mental health challenges, especially people affected by trauma.
And finally,
Dr. Spencer?
Dr. Schiffer.
Schiffer, sorry.
The only other thing I would add is that we should probably take a look too at whether or not we want police doing everything they're doing right now, or if we do want to reallocate some of the services to other community organizations, because that obviously would change any training portfolio that we would want to deploy. And I do think that other organizations are well positioned to do some of the mental health work. Miigwech.
On behalf of the committee, I want to thank Drs. Owusu Bempah and Dr. Schiffer and Dr. Benson for an extraordinary panel. We've now had four extraordinary panels, and I, for sitting in this chair watching the intensity, I can see that you are really influencing the direction of the committee, and I want to thank you for that. With that, and before my staff cuts me off because I'm going to say the A word. I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. I believe it's at 11 o'clock. And you will need new sign-in material in order to be able to access. So until tomorrow morning, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.